Today's panel is called Codes of Non-Fiction. Basically, the brief is to, we'll be looking at the shifts in documentary practice over the past few decades and see how documentary itself is used in a sort of expanded sense now to include various diverse kinds of film practice, right? But before that, I want to introduce the panelists to you because I think in their work, they have sort of used this kind of expanded sense of the documentary, and they use different kind of aesthetic choices. And maybe once we watch, maybe we can watch a few clips from each of their films so that we get a sense of their work. Ayisha, of course, screened her film today, but those of you who are not here, we'll just show a short clip from Straight 8. And then we'll see Mukul's film, Certified Universal, and then Iram's film, There's Something in the Air. It's just a little 3-minute clip just to get a sense of it. I'll also take this a moment to introduce the panelists. Ayisha Abraham, many of you already know her because she's a Bangalore-based artist, and she works with the Srishti School. Her works have been screened at various forums, and she's also a member of the artist collective called Bar One. Mukul, Avijit Mukul Kishore is a filmmaker and cinematographer based in Mumbai. He studied at the Film and Television Institute of India and works in various genres of filmmaking, not just fiction, not just non-fiction, but also fiction and visual art. He's also involved in academic and cultural institutions. And his films have screened and won awards at various international film festivals. Iram Ghufran is a filmmaker based in Delhi. Her work is very interdisciplinary, and she has worked in filmmaking, photography, research, and writing. Iram's work has also been shown and exhibited in several international art and cinematic contexts. She also won the National Award this last year for Best Direction and Editing. So let's just watch the clips and then we can come back to the discussion. Begin by, first of all, deconstructing the idea of the panel itself. So the idea that, this kind of expanded sense of the documentary is happening in the contemporary moment can actually be revisited because if you think about the classic, the Griersonian definition of the documentary as the creative treatment of actuality, which is his definition, which is then come which we have all borrowed in some sense or the other. I think the experiment or the subjective or the blurring of the fiction and the non-fiction was always part of the documentary. It's never been separate from the documentary, but somehow I think in the convention, in the sort of public imagination, there's been a correlation of the documentary with conventions of, say, the talking heads or the commentary, the voice of God commentary, which is unfortunate. But I think once again we have this moment where the documentary has opened up to newer definitions. So this is a good moment to visit that debate. And I was hoping that we can have a discussion starting with Janaki. Janaki is Aisha's sister. confusing. So with Ayisha starting this discussion about her own work and sort of the experimental choices and the use of home movies and found footage, in the work that you do. So.
I mean, I just, thought that I'd show this clip of, from Straight 8, because here Tom kind of reenacts his day-to-day life. So he creates, the classic home movie is a document. It's a raw, uncrafted sort of observation of day-to-day life. And he then takes that form and he creates this sort of a day in the life of his family and his son, and puts himself in it in this kind of goofy way, which is a kind of reflexive way of making a documentary as well. That tradition is there. So there is I don't see that non-fiction and fiction have, been so distinct, that, in a way people have played with it and there has been that experimentation. And yet, clearly there is such a thing as reality versus, completely, fabricating or... Yeah, I think with a lot of my work, I just sort of look at the footage and then I see what there is and then it gets incorporated. But clearly his attempt to make fiction is also a part of the reality of his life, right? He's also recreating. It's a fragment of his life too. So it's hard to sort of make a distinction. Yeah.
It's really interesting because the home movies in your film becomes in the clip that you showed us, Mukul. This ubiquitous presence of the cell phone and the smartphone and all of that, where everybody is sort of, using the camera to record moments of their life. And so what happens then? What happens when everyone has a camera and everyone has access to, say, uploading these, short films about your birthday parties and their weddings and all that on YouTube or places like that? What happens when the whole movie, the context of the whole movie changes, For example, this is a historic footage that you've found, whereas in Mukul, in your film, it's a contemporary moment where everybody's recording home movies. So how does that then play into the idea of the documentary or the non-fiction?
I'd like to start by saying that before I made this film, my first film, Snapshots from a Family Album, is actually a home video. It's made in the form of a home video where I'm shooting things which are apparently not about anything at all. So if you're looking for an issue for a documentary, it's not there. It's conversations, it's fooling around at home, it's joking. And if at all there's a message, it's there in the subtext. So, and through the mode of the home video, you're reflecting on filmmaking itself, you're reflecting on family, you're reflecting on affection and so on. So it's and through a lot of intimacy. But I mean, that was 2004. In this day and age where absolutely everybody has a camera, and plus there's 24-hour news television, I think it becomes important to look at image making itself. I mean, filmmaking, non-fiction, since we're talking about documentary, and image making itself in a historical context of the history of image making and the history of distribution. Where now, let's say if you're starting with the non-fiction image, which is coming to you in the form of the propaganda film, let's say controlled by Films Division in our case, or any other organization internationally. And then that entire responsibility being taken over by the activists sometime in the mid-70s or 80s. And now when there's a complete free-for-all, where anybody can shoot anything, upload anything, screen it, either on television or on the internet, it's my entire thing would be, how then do we relate to the images that we make? with the knowledge that absolutely everybody is doing it, you know, and how does that inform our filmmaking? And it's interesting what Samira does in her film, where she plants cameras all over the bodies of her characters, you know, and what does that do, you know, to a new language, which, you know, in that case evolves. So I feel it's not really, you know, that the binaries that I think a lot of documentaries worked with, which, or not just documentary, I mean any film, even if you're looking at a fiction film. So it's usually this good versus evil kind of thing, you know, that most films play out around, and documentaries pretty much followed the similar structure. There was a good party and an evil party and so on, with good reason. But I feel that, you know, our entire take on, let's say, a subject has in some way to be a little more complex than that, and include the awareness of how images are being made and accessed and consumed these days, you know. So it's interesting, it's very interesting what really is going on, and is it original, is it not, are they evolving a new language? We'll find out, you know, we'll really find out in due course of time. I just like to add something to that, you know, when who we are and what we do is so defined by how our work is made and seen. So when let's say when somebody like me started practicing, the question used to be, if you're a documentary filmmaker, then do you work with an NGO? I guess earlier it used to be, if you're a documentary filmmaker, do you work with Films Division? And off late, students ask me, do you work with National Geographic? So, yeah.
That's really wonderful, and I think we need to really reflect on this idea of image making a little more. But I just want to I just want to flag that for a bit. And I was wondering, Iram, if you could talk about your own sort of film practice, and whether you get asked, you know, do you work for the insane?
I work, anyway. Just to continue, like I'll speak about my work or whatever, like a little later, but is this sounding funny to me or? Yeah, okay, yeah, this is much better. But just a little anecdote, like taking off from what Mukul was saying about cell phone cameras and all. I mean, I know that is also such like a very dated debate and discussion, but important nonetheless. So for this film, the clippings of which I showed, and you didn't see much of the, like we shot a large part of the film in a shrine in a small city in UP. And so the first time that I went for a recce, we've been going to many shrines, so it was almost like they're like one is as good as the other and similar, but this one was a little larger. And so we had a camera, like we had I think a PD 170 or something, which looks like a sort of a camera with a crew, and people have certain associations with them, which are of a mass media and television. And so we were a little scared we are shooting people who are in a shrine. A lot of them are women, possessed. People are, you know, we had concerns about privacy and ethics and all of that. And so, and to keep and be a little sensitive to the space. So the first time we went, we were a little awkward, and so we just put the camera in one corner, like this one is lying in this corner, and so the shrine is somewhere here, and there's people, and at some point in towards the evening, where sort of you can go in and like the whole performance of the possession sort of begins at some point in the evening, say towards 6 o'clock, 5:36. So that began, and I got a little sort of like not scared, but just like what's happening, and suddenly there were all these people with, and believe me, I think at some point we counted, there were at least 30 people and there were like some 200 people who were doing the rounds, 30 people who were shooting that with different kinds of cell phone cameras. And me and Kashif, my camera person, were standing in one corner, scared, not knowing how to respond to this and what to do, camera on kare, off kare. And while 30 films were being made at that time of whatever. So that kind of changed suddenly my relationship also with the space, and I had to kind of think about the cinematic gaze in a slightly different way, because I felt a little challenged, and then I had to go back and think, and I'm still thinking, but yeah, that's just one thing. My own work, I mean, I don't think many people are familiar with it, but I work across sort of platforms, and uh, I think because I trained in documentary and didn't enter sort of documentary filmmaking immediately, but sort of went into working with other artists and filmmakers who were sort of in this non-narrative kind of an experimental zone themselves, and working with uh, single screen, multi-screen, different kinds of platforms, installations. So I think that sort of helped me and informed my own sort of practice. So whatever I do, I mean, even now, I don't think I'm very conscious of being experimental. I mean, I think Veena and I have been having this conversation that I'm not doing anything that I want. This is just the way that I think I know how to do work. And I think for me that sort of instinct is of more value than sort of a very conscious that I'm going to develop a language. I think it evolves on its own. I think we're informed by the things we see around us, and the works of our contemporaries and our singers and all of that. But it's not a very conscious mode. I mean, like, you can be experimental, like the impulse can be there, and it can be there in moments in all the films. But I don't know if you decide before you make a film and say, oh, I'm going to make an experimental film. Like, so yeah.
That's really interesting. It's, in fact, I think all artists or filmmakers, you respond to a moment, you know, which is in front of you, which moves you into to some extent. So I think all, I think Ayisha, I'm sure that the footage that you saw sort of lent itself to a certain kind of treatment, which you probably also happened while you were making the film, right? So it's a process, and it's not a choice that one begins with in that sense, to say that, okay, I'm going to get into category B, which is experimental, or which is very interesting also, because in that sense, to revisit those debates about what is a documentary, and is there like a formula, and unlike the mainstream film, which has a formula, but not any longer, because now we're also doing the Hatke cinema and all that. So there's a way in which we, as a film culture, we've sort of grown away from those categories and those hard and fast rules, I think, that sort of bound us at some point. So I was just wondering if, how, for example, would something like something that has urgency, let's say a slum demolition or something, which, say, in your film you sort of deal with, I was just wondering if that kind of moment, say something happens in front of you, a slum demolition and eviction, would that mold your response in some way? Or, will the treatment still be the way you have done so in your film? Or
if it is something that's immediate, I wouldn't know. I have a very uneasy relationship with that kind of subject. I think it's important to document. It's important to document for reasons of advocacy, for activism. This entire debate as to, let's say, the Vietnam photographs of somebody, a gun being held to somebody's head, and you know that the very next moment this person was dead. Or that girl running towards camera with napalm all over her body and she's naked. The entire debate around the ethics of that situation and the power of those images to build an anti-war opinion globally is something that we all try and negotiate in our relationship to our work. But the one time then that I was asked to shoot a slum demolition, I knew that the filmmaker was coming from a very, very problematic stand. This was a film about the railways, and the whole politics of the filmmaker in that case, who was a British filmmaker, was that this is an encroachment, and these people, it's just an exercise. Their huts will be removed and they'll be back the next day. So we need to shoot that. And I said, I have a huge problem with your entire approach to this. And let's say you have popped this idea, you have popped this information to me at 7 in the morning, when you know that I'm meeting you at 7:30, that you didn't tell me that we're shooting a demolition and how we're shooting it. Let's say I'm here and I don't want you to get into trouble. I'll shoot it from across the tracks. You know, I'll shoot it from across the tracks. You'll get your information. I do not want to shoot close-ups of weeping women. I do not want to shoot low-angle shots of these bulldozers. You know, doing these classic heroic shots of this very violent act, because I know where these guys are coming from. You know, and so we got into a huge argument about it. And at some point, I realized it's not just me. There were two assistants with mini DV cameras who were shooting the same thing. I popped out my tape. I gave it to them. I said, "I'm going bye-bye. I'm not doing this anymore." You know. But which is not to say, I mean, that is me, you know, that is me, but which is not to say that somebody else, let's say that this filmmaker Faiza Khan, who works in Bombay extensively with this slum community in Golibar in Santa Cruz, you know. So, and she is following it up on a sustained basis, you know, uploading these clips and making a documentary and showing it around and being in touch with the community. I mean, if you're asking me how I would do it, I don't know. I really don't know, because, yeah, I mean, I've been looking at my work differently, but I mean, I'm definitely not negating the value of footage which is used that way. And yeah, that's what I say.
I guess the reason why I specifically asked you that question was because your film, A Vertical City, which probably is going to be screened tomorrow, is really a response in some sense to you know, the general process of slum eviction, not necessarily a particular slum eviction, but a process which, you know, leads to this kind of slum rehabilitation and the whole nexus between the state and private real estate players and all of that. So, but your treatment of it was very different, which is why I asked you that question, as compared to, say, a Patwardhan film on the same subject, you know. So I guess that was the impulse behind that.
Let me just come, you know, talk about this in the context of Vertical City, where, and if you remember, there are no on-screen interviews in the film.
Yes.
You know, all the voices are in the background, whether it's the urban studies experts or the people in the community who are affected by this entire project. And we discovered in the first 2 days of filming that doing on-camera interviews in this day and age of live television is a huge project, especially when people are so passionate about a subject which affects them so directly. Where the expectation is that you will arrive and people will make sound bites, and people actually make sound bites. It takes a lot to get an interview going, and the way the film was made, I was not spending that kind of time with the subjects, you know, because we had limited access to the area and so on. And there was just a lot of very, very excited screaming and shouting. And the entire thing that happens when you approach a community is that you get trapped in their entire power structure, where you have to interview first the local leaders and then so on, then their society president and stuff like that. We just made a decision on the second day of shooting, we will just interview people quietly. Because the expectation was that and we told them that this film would be shown on Doordarshan. The expectation was that because you're showing it on Doordarshan, it will be seen by the state. With some kind of assumption that the state doesn't already know what's going on. The state is completely hand in glove with, you know, the entire issue with the whole subject. So, which is why many of the decisions, you know, got made, because it was not the tone that I wanted for the film. It was really not the tone that I wanted for the film. So.
Just to dwell on the subject of the interview itself, because I think all your films, in all your films, there's a sort of relationship that you build with the subject, with your subject. You know, in Ayisha's film, it's Tom Degwar, whose footage you found, and then you mentioned this morning that he later passed away, and then you made the film after that. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the idea of the interview and how that has also changed in today's sort of, again, this what we're calling the expanded sense of the non-fiction cinema.
I just want to go back to what Mukul was saying, and what I find very important and interesting is the ethical component with non-fiction and documentary, and I think in a way that distinguishes the non-fiction from the fiction, even though fiction could possibly be more real than non-fiction in the way it can tell a story about reality or about our lives and our so, you know, I think, and both like rely on narrative and tell stories in possibly different ways. But I think that ethical component is very important for non-fiction, and that distinguishes, I think, the two. And with Straight 8, I remember my dilemma. I was, of course, a lot younger and very, I had never made a film before, so I was quite amateurish and, a little bit nervous. And so I really felt, that I wanted to represent his story, like that it was important for me to even have that one shot of him at the end of the film that I wouldn't do away with, showing him and his frail hands, the texture of his aging skin. But more because whilst interviewing him, the sense I got here, just the sheer joy of having somebody interested in what he was doing was so immense that I really, I didn't just want to use the footage, cut it up, put experimental music on it or whatever. I actually wanted to make a film about him and about this passion and about just being, just doing it because of the sheer love of it without any expectation of recognition. And so, definitely I think that steered the form of the film as well,
Do you want to say something about that? Because I think in your film, since you're dealing with such a fragile, delicate subject, I think the idea of the ethics, that Ayisha brought up was sort of very significant in your film. And you also mentioned your own sort of doubts and dilemmas when you were standing in that space, and...
Yeah, so it's for those who don't know what the film is about, it's like 2 minutes. It's basically the film is dealing with spirituality, spiritual possession and sort of insanity, and kind of focusing on this Sufi shrine where people go to be healed. And there's a whole performance and ritual of the healing that happens. So yeah, there were many sort of all kinds of issues, being an outsider to a certain, which everyone, every filmmaker sitting in this room has sort of grappled with. But so yeah, and the question of the interview and the production of the witness, which kind of, there's always this thing in the documentary to do, the witness and the expert, and we keep kind of swinging between those. So there was that sort of thing also, who is speaking, why, how do I communicate the stories? So somebody has to tell the story, and that person, and what is their relationship to me, and how this film will actually be edited, and how will this emerge? Because while I was shooting, I was not, frankly speaking, very sure of what's going to happen, because a lot of it was in my mind. So yeah, we shot interviews with people who knew what this is for, and there were people who would not give interviews, and people who didn't want to be shot. So these are some basic things I think everyone keeps in mind, but it is in the post, sort of on the editing table, that I realized that that because the person who is being shot in that moment is giving me an interview on the face of me, just what I am. That person is not has not been told of the entire context in which this is going to appear and be seen, and they are going to be discussed. So then I had to, and formally also I was thinking of other strategies. So then I had to remove, like in Mukul. So I worked more with the body rather than the face. So in any case, because I was working with insanity, and I wanted a sense of like a fracturedness of the person. So yeah, there's a lot of focus on the hands and the feet and sort of the back. And if faces are there, then they're kind of like you're not sure which voice belongs to who. So yeah, so that is there. But at the same time, the people who at least I interviewed in the film and who I worked with were very keen that their stories be communicated. And these are all people, again, television is a very, very important thing. So in a way, in their heads, they were going to be on TV. So there were stories that they wanted a larger world to know, and they had no hesitation in telling that story. All the doubts and the dilemmas were actually mine. And so then I dealt with it in the way that I removed sort of faces and stuff. Yeah.
It's It's very interesting because it really struck me in your film, you know, how you've protected your subjects, you know, in the sense, like you have the cell phone, but, you know, with the recorded sort of interview, but you just show a shot of the cell phone. You know, you don't show any, the interaction between the patient and, say, the counselor or the doctor. So I think that really struck me, and also it struck me in your film because you, again, you sort of protect your, in some sense, I'm just calling it protection, but you sort of, you know, protect the interests of your interviewees, you know, just your subjects, which is a very, which is not so common anymore, because there's a way in which the camera, which we talked about, has become so obtrusive. You know, it's a constant presence in our lives, and sometimes you don't even know it, and you're being recorded from someone's, you know, pen cameras recording you, and you don't even know it. So that kind of obtrusive presence of the camera, I think, has made us once again be reflective about the ethical dimensions of this kind of recording. So I just want to come back to this idea that we started off, which is trying to get to a sense of what this means for us in the sense of having an expanded, expanded sense of the documentary or the expanded sense of non-fiction cinema. How does that then help us, or how is it sort of a useful or a productive category to work with, in the sense why are we actually having this sort of discussion today, and what is the balance of or value of this kind of what is the value of this kind of discussion? Continue, yeah. So do you want to?
Ayisha, would you like to take that?
Frankly, the notion of an expanded cinema or expanded, for me as an artist, really means taking the image away from conventional modes of viewing, of presentation. So for me, it is about the way the audience can possibly interact with the image, can walk around it, can that the single channel can actually split itself up into multiple screens. I don't know whether I think that different genres of documentary, different ways of telling a story is necessarily expanded. I think that a lot of it has existed in different forms. I mean, every person who picks up a camera will tell a story in a different way. So I don't know whether we've entered an expanded, a sense of expanded documentary. I'm not sure that for me, that term usually, I mean, for me, being an artist, coming from, you know, that you sort of create the ways of, or we structure the ways of receiving it, and receiving images. So perhaps you don't have a beginning and an end, but something's moved, that it's, has other forms outside of the classic narrative structure. So I don't know whether that answers your question.
Very tricky question. I've only thinking of my work, even and how I not a generic statement. Even the experiment is like because there is a whole body of filmmakers who are very consciously doing experimental work, and this balance of the document. So there will be people who will be making films with a certain sort of purpose, which is, I suppose, like different. So mine just sort of. So I don't want to comment on that. And for me, I do not look at my work and in terms of this value generating thing. In the sense that obviously there is value in an expression. There is value in the idea that I'm putting out. There's a value, there's effort, there's labor, physical labor that goes. Filmmaking is very hard, that goes into it. But I'm a little, I'm not sure actually at this stage in my life about what this value question, that something has to be viewed because it has a certain kind of value. Maybe, maybe I think we need to expand. That is where the expansion needs to be there. Because films are of all kinds. We need to expand our, I suppose, way of even looking at the image. Maybe it is just an expression and that's all that there is to it. And that is its value. So, so when I'm doing my work and the kind of things that I get excited by, it is always the sort of the inexplicability of the real, in a way. So in a way I'm working with documentary image and the real image, but I like to make it and approach it or get excited by ideas which are sort of fantastical or magical or mythical in some way. That is not to say that that is the only sort of way of looking at documentary. But I don't know, I suppose the question of value is something that, I don't know, maybe it's like bothers me a little always.
I would think that there's actually all kinds of work that has always existed. And it is what is considered to be the norm at the particular given time, which overshadows a lot of other forms. And my experience is this entire question as to who have you made this film for and what is the target audience of your film, is a very flawed question, is really a very flawed question, because you make the films available to people and you'll be surprised at who relates to a film which you possibly thought is not meant for them. Very often you've done something completely abstract and a projectionist comes out and says, I really liked it. It doesn't even have language in it. It's images and so on, So, I mean, I just feel that that is more a question of marketing and distribution. So very, very often you get asked in screenings, what is the target audience of this film? And that's a marketing question. Who is showing this film? So again, going back to, are you Films Division, are you an NGO, or are you National Geographic? Because that is the perception of who makes documentaries and why they make them and who they make them about. It's always about the other, about an African tribe or about an alligator mating or something, So, but no, sorry, I mean, I don't mean to be flippant, but so the entire body, like we saw Sukhdev's work this afternoon, the entire body of the fantastic experimental work that happened in Films Division, which was not seen for a very, very long time, for the reason that FD itself had gone comatose for a very long time, And it's all there, it's all existed, and there's much to take from that. There's really much to take from that tradition, or what we were discussing, I think, over lunch or maybe later, the entire notion of what is fiction and what is non-fiction. If you look at the very first images that were made, which is what you were talking about, the Lumiere images, whether it's workers coming out of a factory or train arriving at a station, is this fiction or non-fiction? We've all read about this, that people coming out of the train, at least the ones in the first couple of bogies have been prepared. Because what will happen? You take out a camera on the streets here in 2013, anywhere in the world, you have a crowd around you in no time. People are asking you what's going on. So just think of the first time it was done with a large camera which is hand cranked, and a train comes and stops and people come out as if nothing's happening. So what does that mean? What is that a reflection on? So the entire thing of fiction, non-fiction and stuff, it immediately blows away. It's interesting. It's always...
In the sense that today, if I think of, and I'm speaking in a very generic sense, what is a factual image? And if that factual image is, for instance, say the news image. I'm not even talking about the politics of news. I'm talking about the politics of that, the dynamics of that image, which is a newsy image. Is that actually factual, or is there a fiction in that image as well, in terms of its production as well as in terms of its reception? And here, I think it's a very complicated terrain, which I think a lot of filmmakers are therefore thinking about. And I mean, so if I'm talking about spectatorship or non-fiction, fiction, I think this is the new sort of I don't know what the word for this is a new access around which the debate around the image is, for me, sort of centered. And I kind of am familiar a little bit with Mukul and Iram's work, not so much with Ayisha's, but whatever little I've seen of it. this is what I think sort of pivots their work together as well. It's my reading of it completely. But I'm just kind of putting some thoughts on the table, and I'm wondering if one can complicate the idea of an image production today, of actuality, fiction, non-fiction, and reception along these lines. I'm just sort of, that's all.
I want to think about this, but when you use the word, like we've narrated about fiction and non-fiction, I mean, I think a lot of us are using the word like moving image to describe our practice, especially people who work in video. I mean, they are the people I interact with more. So then I think maybe we can sort of dispense with the words fiction and non-fiction in a way. Yeah, and using that. It is not easy. It is not easy. It has to be like a case-by-case thing. So one can speak for oneself, I suppose, and for a particular work, I guess, or a set of images, I suppose.
So I think since you mentioned actuality, and what really is an image without, it's even more complicated now in this entire realm of what is fiction and what is not, especially since we're talking about the mass media. And who's controlling the flow of information? Is it the state? Is it, and in this day and age with this entire monster called 24-hour news television, where you have an image which is of an actual event, and you edit it to background music, you loop it, you completely change the temporality of the event, and you keep running it and with sound effects and music and so on, where the sound effects on that and a Balaji TV show are the same every time the camera moves, So the entire thing, at some level, of course, you get very upset by everything, and the entire use that it is put to, which is to actually create anxiety and to titillate, and to cater to absolutely the lowest instinct in you, which is to watch, to be a voyeur, to really be a voyeur, But on the other hand, I feel if you just step back, I feel it's an acknowledgement of the fact that this is a complete construct. That it's actually a complete construct. I don't know whether people actually, whether consumers actually see it as that. But it's an acknowledgement that you can put absolutely anything in any form unedited as it's streaming live on air and it's news, So at some level, I feel it's an acknowledgement of the fact that, we are constructing this. We are constructing this, and the very obvious way in which, again, this brings us back to, activist documentary, which was the norm for the longest time, where it was essential, let's say starting with the emergency, for an independent filmmaker to present the other view, which was completely hidden because your media was completely censored. Information was coming only through the state media, which was Doordarshan and Films Division. So it was the independent filmmakers who were bringing you the other view. And that is a role that completely, and that's a language that's completely been spoiled and abused by news television, which is always ping pong, one party, second party, third party, or six parties in split screens, and so on. So at some level, it's, if you just step back and you just, I don't know, you watch it as an artwork, sometimes. If you can really stop yourself from getting angry at what they're doing, So yeah, and deal with family members actually getting engaged with that and discussing it over dinner. So.
I just feel it's very nice, this discussion, and it's nice to foreground one more thing in this, just to bring it to the foreground, which is the common notion of subjective and objective. And I think that we actually just haven't really processed that in some sense as viewers and as just people receiving all sorts of media. So I do think that when we are talking about fiction and non-fiction, one of the problems, strangely and amazingly, still is that we are thinking of non-fiction as objective. In some strange, warped, subliminal way, even though we know of the constructions which go to ridiculous extents, as Mukul is saying, but somehow we are not able to get out of that sense that even though we know that even Flaherty had constructed, there is a way in which we still believe that non-fiction is objective and that fiction is subjective. So I just feel it's nice to just foreground those words and see that that's not so.
Do you think that when the viewership is there, or like when you're catering, he said you're not keeping an audience in mind. And we were having a discussion yesterday that why films? Any product today is it the consumer whom you keep in mind, or you bring the product and then it happens and the consumer accepts it?
I mean, if you are, let's say, talking about a certain audience which probably has a shorter attention span, then you'll make a spot which is shorter. You will not make a 52-minute film. You know, you'll make a 5-minute. No, there are all kinds of films.
Yeah.
There are all kinds of films and all kinds of audiences. So, yeah, of course, if you're talking about an audience that needs to consume it in a short duration, then it's there. You know, it's there, and yeah, there are. Absolutely. And the most effective film in this regard is one, the advertising film, which is a form of non-fiction film. Can we call it non-fiction? Fiction? Not? Huh? Sorry?
Sometimes it's fiction. It's mostly
Sometimes
fiction.
it's fiction. Okay,
It's
sometimes
mostly
it's
fiction.
mostly fiction, but I don't know. I mean, it's talking about you. In that case, it's trying to sell you something. So there's a non-fiction element to it. It's staged, but there's a non-fiction element to it if it's trying to sell you a certain product and something. Or look, okay, let me just change this. Give you a different example. I'll give you a different example. All your, let's say coming from the state, if you have a filler which comes on television which talks about national integration. You know?
That's also fiction. Okay, well. But no, I don't want to derail.
Okay, sorry, I put my mic down.
When I think of an idea, it comes from a personal space because of something having moved you or something, and it's a sort of a ongoing exploration as I make the film, from scripting to shooting and things, of that idea, and it keeps getting developed. And then I find pretty soon into that thinking, there's this idea of this imaginary audience like we discussed. And then I almost always find myself fighting between, is it entertaining or is it saying something? And it has to be a bit of both, but not too much of entertainment and not too much of an activist, but it should have a voice. And I don't know, there's always this tug of war. And even though you theoretically understand that it doesn't have to be either, but I find people who I discuss it with giving me feedback in those two realms, and people viewing it in those things. So I'm just wondering if it's easy to actually escape these two kind of opposing forces.
It's possible today to do that because you can make a film cheap. You know, it is possible for you to make a film without worrying about a lot of funding or the money that it would take to buy film. So I think that, you know, definitely the accessibility of technology and, you know, opens up. There's no reason why you can't make a film that's... I think there was an era when if you had to make 16mm documentary, you know, you would have to worry about funding and where you were going to get that stock from.
The notion of fiction, non-fiction, reality or otherwise. The fact that somebody, this whole question of something was rendered objective because it came from some source, but that itself was a subjective, even that point of a P2C was a subjective point of view. So the question therefore is if it's indeed, and it's similar in many other works of fields of art, why does it matter so much here? So does it matter because there is still that ambiguous anxiety, so to speak, about objectivity, and therefore, and that is again couched again once you go down the objectivity route, you're going down another route altogether. So there's a question of legitimacy. Sheep says acceptance, which is again we're going down receptivity. But the question of it doesn't go away, which is why sometimes I feel that within this world, slightly rarefied world, if I may, it also takes courage to say I want to make an entertaining documentary. Which makes, what is entertaining in any way? Something that appeals to somebody in a manner which... So this question of when you talk about timing, in other fields of like art, it's true what Samira is saying. I mean, you know where it needs to stop. It's like it's something, if you created a work of art, you know where you're bullshitting beyond the point. And you know that it has to stop. Or if you don't know it yourself, you're so much in love with yourself, that you perhaps need a good friend or somebody who's to tell you that no, you're getting narcissistic here. So
that's when you know the audience.
No, but that's a different point. Your point about the client, which Mukul so eloquently responded to, is a slightly different point. You're making a client point, which is what is it the client wants. At one time, the client was the government, NGO. Today, you're saying, I mean, that's the world we live in. But you needn't be dictated by those terms when you're creating a work of art. It's that point. So if you're being dictated, whether it's a matter of timing or of content, some other point, then it's taking you to some other level. At the same time, there is, of course, whenever you're creating something, there is somebody who's reading, listening, thinking, but you're not being dictated in some way. That's my response to you. But I guess Samira answered whatever.
I would just like to add one point here, that I guess the reason why I'm practicing in this non-fiction kind of realm is because it provides for this kind of debate. It provides for multiple forms to exist within the entire umbrella of what we call documentary or non-fiction, as against fiction, which is completely tied to. If you're talking about, let's say, if you're talking about fiction filmmaking, which needs to get released and shown and so on, I feel there are many more venues of showing documentary in this kind of space informally to people who might want to see it, as against fiction film, which needs to get into the theatre because it's a bigger investment and so on, which is why, let's say, somebody like me is not interested in doing it. I don't, because this is smaller, I can make it cheaper, I can make it quicker, I can make it more intimately, and it can be about me or my shoes or my cat or whatever. It can be about anything, it can be about a political subject or whatever. But there's the possibility to do it in a form that we might want to use. Whereas if you're getting into the mainstream, then you clearly don't have that possibility. Unfortunately, is how it.
You said that this construction of mainstream and alternative itself is undergoing a lot of.
It's not. No, it's not. It's not. It really isn't, because the film that really gets up there is mainstream.
So I think it's time to wrap up the discussion. Thank you very much for coming here today and participating so actively, and thank you the panelists for participating as well.